Hi, welcome to the 30-day novel NaNoWriMo series. Today is day 16. My name is Lynn Johnston, and I blog at writesmarternotharder.com. As always, today we're going to talk about how you can move your story forward. Today, your protagonist and his or her allies are sallying forth from the midpoint. Your characters are embarking on a new plan, which is going to point them straight toward the antagonist forces or something that the antagonist forces are willing to protect. How is your protagonist's goal changed as a result of his or her midpoint discovery? If it does change, maybe it's not going to change. Maybe what your protagonist is going to do is just become even more determined to achieve that goal as a result of making that midpoint discovery. Also, you might want to ask yourself how your protagonist's feelings about the goal has changed. Maybe the protagonist feels ambivalent now. Maybe the protagonist's doubts were removed by the discovery. Maybe that midpoint discovery was something that made your protagonist go, wow, I am so on the right track. This is absolutely what I'm supposed to be doing. I no longer have any doubts that I should be trying to defeat the antagonist or that I should be trying to achieve this goal. Your other characters are also going to be impacted by the midpoint discovery. And now that your protagonist is charging off in a new direction, you have to look at how this changes either the goals or the attitudes of any of the other characters. And like we said yesterday, this can be a fantastic source of conflict for you. Whatever allies your protagonist has, they all should have their own agendas. They shouldn't be an extension of your protagonist. So whatever agenda they're pursuing and whatever reasons they have for having accompanied the protagonist so far should be affected by whatever changes happen in the protagonist's behavior. If any of these characters were negatively impacted by the midpoint discovery, what are they doing about it? Have they secretly hatched a plot that they're going to blindside the protagonist with later in the story? Are they just starting to doubt a lot? Are they maybe slacking off in their behavior, or maybe even misleading the protagonist because what the protagonist wants doesn't match what they want anymore? So conflict. This is where you want to look for conflict at the midpoint, is how the protagonist's change of direction affects everybody else in the story and what they're going to do about that change. So conflict, you also, in addition to looking at the interpersonal, you still want to look for external obstacles. What do the protagonist and his or her allies have to overcome in order to execute their new plan? What are they lacking? What have they lost or sacrificed or taken on as a burden as a result of achieving the midpoint discovery? Do they have to give up something really crucial to their quest in order to get it? Did someone die as a result of their quest to get to the midpoint discovery? Also, you want to look at your antagonist. What's your antagonist forces up to? Do they know about the protagonist discovery? If not, do they learn about it? Or do they keep just going along with whatever they were already doing because it's a complete secret to them? And also, even if it's a secret to them now, probably by the climax, they're going to find out about it because the discovery is something that impacts what the protagonist does at the climax in order to defeat the antagonist. If your protagonist has retrieved a sacred artifact and that plays into the climax of your story, and it probably should if you've actually sent them to this point and had them have the discovery of the artifact be the focus of the middle of your story, and be the thing that changes the direction of the story, it's probably important enough that it should be involved in the climax somehow. And maybe your antagonist doesn't know that the protagonist has the statue until the climax. That's okay. Maybe it's a surprise. Or maybe they find out before that, and that changes the antagonist's behavior whenever they do find out. So looking at your setting, how do your setting elements serve as obstacles to the protagonist's new plan? Now that your protagonist is going off in another direction, some of the old obstacles are going to fall away, but new obstacles are going to spring up. And you might want to ask yourself, how does the new plan require the protagonist and his or her allies to explore locations they've never been to, or to see new aspects of a familiar location. And this is a fantastic opportunity for you, especially if you're writing a story where world building is important. Taking a look right now at the terrain your protagonist has to cover between the midpoint and the climax of the story, chances are you've already set up most of the crucial world building elements, at least in terms of like introducing the rules of the world and giving the reader a feel for what kind of world it has. But you also want to think about what wonders you can unveil between the midpoint and the climax, and how those amazing, awesome, cool aspects of the setting you've been working so hard on can actually impact the plot. If you've got settings you want to show off, you might want to think about how you can work those into the second half of your protagonist's quest. Or maybe if you've got settings that are going to show up in later books, maybe this is the point where your protagonist hears about those strange and mystical lands that he may someday visit. He hears a legend, or he meets someone who's come back from one of those places that he hasn't visited yet. So this is a good time to do some planning, not just for this book and not just for today's writing, but for the rest of this book and possibly future books. Looking at your story promise, again, you want to just keep in mind whatever promises you've made already that you need to fulfill in the second half, and also think a little bit about what promises you want to make to the reader about the second half of the story. How the protagonist takes this first step out of the midpoint and towards the climax is kind of foreshadowing to the reader how the second half of the book is going to go, because basically we're seeing your protagonist renewed in some way or changed in some way, and how they behave in today's scenes basically is hinting to the reader, hey, this is now how the character is going to be, or this is what the character's change has to be. So think about how you might telegraph that or hint at it in small ways, depending on what kind of story you're telling, whether or not you want it to be obvious or really subtle. That's a judgment call. But thinking about it now is going to make the dark moment a little bit easier, because the dark moment is that point before the climax where the protagonist gives up hope, and the dark moment is tied to the character growth arc. The climax is tied to the character growth arc. How the character has changed has to play into the climax. And if you think about it now, finishing that growth arc in a satisfying way for the reader is going to be a lot easier if you've thought about how the story unfolds around the growth arc. Getting started. As always, pre-writing ritual, warm-up exercise, rereading what you wrote yesterday or rereading your notes. Whatever you've been doing that's working, do it. If you are struggling to get back into your story, if you maybe had a few days off because of your life was busy or whatever interfered with that, and you're coming back to it, I strongly encourage you to reinstitute the pre-writing ritual or institute a new one if you feel like the one you had before didn't help you stick with it. It's okay to stop and pick a new one. And because writing is so mental and so emotional, I kind of recommend that your pre-writing ritual include something physical, especially if you're someone who doesn't get a lot of exercise already. Having your body be in good shape and getting some movement every day, keeping the blood flowing at the optimal rate to your brain, getting oxygen to your brain, getting nutrients to your brain, that all happens optimally when you move a little bit. So even if you have a fairly sedentary day normally, take a few minutes to go for a walk before you write. Do some stretching, do a headstand to get some blood going to your head, do a yoga pose. It doesn't have to be a whole routine. It could be one yoga pose, just something that kind of makes you feel good, makes you feel relaxed, and kind of gets the blood flowing. So anyway, whatever you can do to get into it, that's just my personal preference and what I find works for me. And I recommend trying it if you haven't. Also, today is a really good day for you to think about how external circumstances or events are driving both your protagonist and your antagonist in the second half of your story. For example, does your story have a ticking clock? Is there some deadline that both your protagonist and antagonist have to meet? Do the stars have to be aligned a certain way at the climax for the antagonist to use his evil death ray? Is there a coronation that the protagonist has to get to in order to stop an assassination plot? What's happening in your story that can ratchet the tension up a little bit, ratchet the stakes up a little bit, and make your readers go, oh my gosh, not only does this have to happen, this is super important that the protagonist gets where he needs to go and does what he needs to do, but also we don't have that much time. We have to get there by a specific time. So that ticking clock is very effective. You can use it in big ways. You can use it in small ways. It doesn't have to be at the climax either. Maybe one of the ways that you keep your story going in this third quarter, and because we are entering the third quarter of the story now, maybe you give them a very small ticking clock. Maybe they have an informant that they have to get to before the antagonist does, because the antagonist intends to kill him. Maybe they have to. You can use it in scenes. If you've got a scene that is not tense enough and you need to add some additional conflict, make your character need to catch the bus and make them late. Have there be something that they have to get done by a specific time to give yourself a little more tension. Also looking at how circumstances can force it. Like, for example, the weather. The weather can make things harder for your antagonist. The weather can make things more urgent for your antagonist. If your antagonist is like passing through a mountain, they might want to get to a certain point before the snowstorm hits. If you're looking at social circumstances, if there's a mob of people gathering outside the building where your protagonist and their allies are hiding, they need to get out of there before that mob explodes into a lynch mob. So I'm sure you get my point. Just like external circumstances, social circumstances, psychological circumstances, whatever you can do to have your protagonists and your antagonist environment also increasing the urgency, that's a good idea. And remember, pace-wise, we're heading into the climax now. Your reader is probably a little bit tired. It's like they've gone through the whole stressful experience of your protagonist getting sucked into their journey, having crises, getting to the first pinch point, and having things not go the way they want. They've gotten to the midpoint. They've gotten a little bit of resurgence. Having the pace accelerate a little bit in the third quarter is not a bad thing, especially if you're writing an adventure. This is the point of the story where it is really easy to have your characters wandering around randomly in a forest where every day looks the same for for several chapters, and you don't want that. You want every scene in your story to be something different and something interesting, and you still want that story goal to feel urgent to the reader. You don't want the reader to go like, midpoint discovery, they finally found the sacred gem, they finally figured out where they have to go to enter the villain's secret lair. Okay, it's probably gonna be fine from here. You want your reader to still be going, holy crap, how are they getting out of this? How are they going to get where they need to go in time? How are they possibly going to gather enough resources or do what they need to do to even get to the climax before they even face off with the villain? How did they even make that journey to the villain? And you need to make that journey exciting. As always, after you write, please celebrate your progress. Acknowledge that you've done something awesome by being disciplined and writing for 16 days in a row. I encourage you to prepare for tomorrow. Tomorrow you want to make things easy so you don't have to spend a lot of time and effort getting started. Happy writing on day 16, and I look forward to talking with you tomorrow.